Welcome back, everybody. This time is going to be an introduction to Japanese verbs. We'll start with the different types and then build from there. The first thing you need to know is that in the base form there are two main types of verbs and then two exceptions in a group of their own. Now there are two common ways these are taught: Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3. The second way is known as U verbs, Ru verbs, and irregular verbs, respectively. The second method is the way that I was taught, and I also find it more useful because within the name it gives some kind of indication of what type it is, so it's easier to remember. But everybody has a different learning style, so I'm going to list them both throughout this video for your benefit. The second footnote is that all verbs end in an U sound, whether it be a singular U or as a part of a second character. Su, nu, gu, etc. So, starting with U verbs, or Group 1, we'll use the word used in the previous lesson as our example. 私はパンを買います. So following the SOV sentence structure, you can tell that 買います is the verb. However, this is in the polite form. The dictionary or basic form of this verb, as I mentioned, has to end in U. So the dictionary form of this verb is 買う. If you remember your kana chart, U is in the center. A, I, U, E, O. Think of this as a base, like V for verb. U is in the middle where you start with, and as you go out to the ends, you change the meaning slightly. Like before, ka-u became ka-i-mas. This is called a few different things, but the easiest is just mas form. However, I prefer the other name, the stem form, because this form is used to link to other things later. So the I is just the beginning, or stem. So, if U is the dictionary form and I is the mas or stem form, what are the others? Let's start with E. Ka-u becomes ka-e-ru. So the verb that means to buy becomes can buy. It is because of this that this form is called the can form, or potential form. Potential forms of verbs in Group 1 become Group 2 verbs, or Ru verbs, so I'll backpedal to those when I get there. There is an alternate to this as well. If you say kae instead of kaeru or kaemas, it becomes the command form, or the imperative form, as some teachers like to call it. So kae would be someone ordering another person to buy something. However, this is usually a yell or with some anger behind it, so it's relatively rude. I don't recommend using this with everyone. The next one is o, so ka-u becomes ka-o. This is known as the volitional form, and it changes the meaning from to buy to let's buy. However, this form only works in casual or slang situation. If you want to say it in a more polite way, you would use the mas form and change ka-u to kaimashou, and that leaves us with the last one, a. I've saved this one for last because it's the first exception to the rules. Generally, when you shift u to a and add nai, it becomes the negative form. So for example, nomu, which means to drink, in this form would be nomanai, meaning not drink or don't drink. However, for verbs that just end in u, when you move them up to a, instead you have to change it to wa and then add nai. So ka-u becomes kawanai, meaning not or don't buy. Makes sense, right? No! I know, it's weird, but it would be just far too difficult and confusing to say ka-nai. With the wa substituted, it adds a clear distinction between the syllables and makes it much easier to say. However, once again, this form only works in the casual speech. If you want to say it more politely, you would use the mas form and change it from ka-u to ka-imasen. Now that we have the basics, let's go down the line and look at the other ones, starting with kaku, which means to write. If you want to say it politely, you would say kakimasu. If you wanted to say can write, you would say kakeru. And if you wanted to command someone to write, you would say kake. Then if you wanted to say let's write, you would say kako, or politely kakimashou. And finally, if you want to say don't or won't write, you would say kakanai, or kakimasen. Remember, the K line can be modified to the G line, so to show that, we'll use the verb oyogu, which means to swim, or politely you would say oyogimasu. Can swim, oyogeru. Swim, oyoge. Let's swim, oyogo, or politely oyogimashou. And now the negative, oyoganai, or oyogimasen. Now remembering our kana chart, the next one is the S line. So to choose an example from here, I will say hanasu, meaning to speak. Now before I move on, I want to stress that this is different than iu, as I mentioned earlier as an example. Hanasu means to speak, iu means to say. Now then, going down the list, hanasu, or politely hanashimasu. Can speak, hanaseru. Commanding someone to speak, hanase. Let's speak, hanasou, or politely, hanashimashou. And finally, don't or won't speak, hanasanai, or politely, hanashimasen. It's worth noting here that the modified form of zu has 0 verbs in the Japanese language. I think you guys have got the hang of it now, so I'm just going to go down. Motsu, mochimasu. Motteru, motte. Mottou, mochimashou. Motanai, mochimasen. For the end line, I'm sorry I have to use this verb, but there aren't a lot of verbs that end in nu. So we will be using shinu, which means to die. So, on to the list. Shinu, shinimasu, shineru, shine. Shinou, shinimashou, shinanai, shinimasen. For the H line, we have to use the modified form verb asobu. This means to play or to spend time with. The reason we have to use a bu verb is because there are also 0 verbs that end in hu or pu. The forms for this one would be asobu, asobimasu, asoberu, asobe, asobou, asobimashou, asobanai, asobimasen. For the M line, we already have a verb that you know from earlier. Nomu, meaning to drink. So let's just get to it. Nomu, nomimasu. Nomeru, nome. Nomou, nomimashou. Nomanai, nomimasen. Now the last one is the R line. And now, yes, I know I already told you there's a separate group devoted to ru verbs or group 2 verbs. However, there are some group 1 verbs ending in ru that behave differently than their group 2 counterparts. I'm not sure if this will help or hurt, but because of this overlap, I wanted to explain these together. But it's looking like I'm running out of room, so let's start with group 2 verbs. For this one, we'll use the test subject of taberu. This verb means to eat. With ru verbs, instead of the u changing sound, the ru is dropped completely. So taberu becomes tabemasu. The can form would take taberu to taberareru. Now recently, younger generations have started, instead of saying taberareru, and just saying tabereru. The reason people started saying it like this is probably because it mimics the u verb format. Ka-u, kaeru, taberu, tabereru. However, this is not recommended to speak in this way because another form, called the passive form, is exactly the same as this ra-less form. So it can get really confusing and you have to use context. So please don't use it. This is generally thought of as just slang, but I teach it to you now so you at least understand when it's said to you. Additionally, while we're on the tangent of potential form, this is also a ru verb, or group 2 verb. So to make it the polite form, you would change it from taberareru to taberaremasu. I know I've been talking a lot, but do you remember when I said this? Potential forms of verbs in group 1 become group 2 verbs, or ru verbs, so I'll backpedal to those when I get there. Well, u verbs, or group 1 verbs, when they're in the potential form, are now ru verbs, or group 2 verbs. So, ka-u becomes ka-edu, and then politely becomes ka-emasu. It's worth noting here that unlike in the u verb category, you can't just remove the ru from the potential form to make the command form. Kaeru, kae. For the ru verbs, you have to change the ru to a ro, so taberu becomes tabero. And conversely, if you want to say let's eat, you wouldn't say tabero, you would say tabeyo. And the polite form would be tabemashou. At least the negative form is easy. You would just drop the ru and add nai. So taberu becomes tabenai, and then politely tabemasen. Backing up to the last of the u verbs, we would do the same as the others in group 1. This time our example will be hashiru, meaning to run. So let's go down our list. Hashiru, hashirimasu, hashireru, and now that we know the polite form, hashiremasu, command form, hashire, hashiro, hashirimashou, hashiranai, and finally, hashirimasen. It may be difficult to get used to this because there really isn't a pattern to explain the difference between ru or u verbs. The only advice I can give you is that ru verbs, or group 2, always end in iru or eru. However, there are some group 1 verbs that end this way as well. You really just have to get used to it. Nobody told you this was going to be easy. The final group only consists of 2 verbs. This is known as group 3 or irregular verbs. What I mean by irregular is that each of these have their own special rules that only apply to them. The first one is suru. This is the basic verb just to mean to do. Going from the dictionary form, suru, the polite form would be shimasu. Now, I was never taught this way, but I found it easy to understand. This one seems to follow both group 1 and group 2 rules. The ru is dropped and the remaining su becomes shi. Up until now, the next one we explained was the can form. However, there is no can form for suru. You have to use a different verb completely. Dekiru. This just means can. The command form would be shiro, similar to group 2. And then likewise, the volitional form, shiyo. That leaves us with the negative form, shinai, or shimasen. I'm sorry, I know I've been talking for a while, but there's only one left. The verb to come, kuru. Now this one's a mess, so let's just get into it to get it over with. The polite form would go from kuru to kimasu, and then the can form follows group 2 slightly by going from kuru to korareru. Likewise, the command form keeps the ko and goes from kuru to koi. The volitional form also keeps the ko and becomes koyo, or kimashou. And finally, the negative form, konai, or kimasen. That was a lot to cover, but there's still so much more. Please join me next time and we'll have you speaking Japanese before you know it. See you later. Ja ne.